to painting Snowdrops with Bristol and Breve. I'm going to sort of recreate the lesson that we did for our live Paint With Me 2 weeks ago. So Snowdrops are one of the traditional birth month flowers for January. They're also something that I, as a person who really misses spring and flowers all winter long, appreciate, since they tend to bloom very early in the year, often peeking up right through the snow, which is why I've chosen to set mine into a little bit of snow. So today we're going to look at briefly how to mix the right color for what you're going to need, a couple of different strokes to put these flowers together, and then we'll just practice making the flowers and how to put the stems together. It's really a pretty simple flower. It just requires a little bit of practice on getting the color that you like and on getting the stroke for the petals right, but it's really overall very simple, and I think you'll enjoy it. So let's move on to our color mixing. I've already got most of what I need mixed up because I was doing samples, as you could tell, but I will kind of run down what I've got for you. I've got this section right here, believe it or not, is what we're going to paint our white with. It's kind of a very diluted gray, very diluted. This is mostly water. There's darker off to the edge over here if I needed to like adjust my color, but even so, this puddle is a little bit of pigment at the bottom of a lot of water. And the way that I get this kind of neutral gray that I like for painting these white flowers with is mixing a dark blue and a dark brown. So this used to be navy, which I make out of Payne's gray, ultramarine, and a little tiny bit of phthalo blue to get a sort of dark, relatively neutral blue. And then this brown over here is just a mess of things that I've mixed over a long time. But if you want to replicate it, you probably, in any basic set, have a sort of a darkish brown. It might be like an umber. That will be fine. It'll probably be a little warmer than the one that I'm using here. You can mix it with, I have a little bit of a black right out of a tube that is on the warm side, and sometimes I'll mix that in. Though some blacks are on the cool side, so you'll want to know that before you dive right in. If you need to cool it down a little bit, Payne's gray is a really nice dark color that will cool things right down for you. And since you might have noticed that umber that I was using was a little on the red side, the blueness and the Payne's gray cancel each other out pretty well. So then I just take a little bit of this and I worked it into my navy. I don't need very much because I've already done this mixing. But since this used to have navy all over it, it does tend to get a little more blue over time. So I'll periodically mix a tiny bit more brown into it to kind of neutralize it again. And then the real key to getting this to look like a white flower is to use probably a lot more water than you think you need. I have a spray bottle that I use to help wet down my palette. And I also find that just like spraying it a few times helps me get the water that I need much faster than actually trying to wait for, you know what I mean, like dip your brush and like bring water over that way. I find to be pretty slow. So that's kind of the mixture for that, and you'll just need to adjust a little once you're painting on your own paper until you decide you like it. The green I do tends to run a little on the light side. I usually start all of my greens with this, it's called Forest Green. It's from my Sennelier set, but I consider it a fairly generic green. I wouldn't say a primary green because there's no such thing. Green's a secondary color, but you know, it's not extremely dark, but it definitely has some potency to it. And it's just kind of a very in the middle planty sort of green. It's not terribly olive colored. It's not super on the blue side. So I usually start my green mixes with that. And then I'd like this to actually get just a little bit lighter than it is. So I'm going to introduce some of this light green that I have here as well, also a Sennelier color. But if you don't have this, you could go straight to a yellow. I may add some of that as well. And you can add whichever yellow you prefer until you get the color that you like. Yellow is one of those ones that, depending on your brand, some of them have a little white in them and some of them don't. So you'll need to really figure out with your own paint set which ones have more transparency, because some yellows will really, really quickly turn your green a different color, and some yellows you'll barely notice. So I'm pretty happy with where that is. I might wind up putting a little more water in it, but we're not even going to paint the stems quite yet, so I'll just let that, I'll let that sit, and we'll probably adapt it a little bit when we get there. Let's come back over here and just freshen this petal up, because I can see it kind of separating a little bit. And part of that is because I have a little more water than this palette can really contain over here, and so it keeps bleeding my color back in for me, but we'll live through it. Also, if you haven't heard this tip from me 100,000 times, this is my mixing brush. It used to be a brush I painted with. It's a Simply Simmons, but that's really just kind of one of those brands that you find very, very affordably at a lot of local art stores. It might not be called this at your art store, but they'll probably have something in this neighborhood. And it was a round brush, and it at one time had a nice point on it, but as you can probably see, the tip is all completely worn off from lots of use. And so I just keep it around to mix my paints with so that I don't wear the tip off of my newer brushes. That's definitely something that I recommend. You save some of your older brushes for either mixing or for certain types of dry brushing techniques that are just gonna kill a nice new expensive brush. Okay, so that's the only two colors we actually need for this project at the moment. I'm gonna dry off my surface because it was misting and sometimes that gets little driplets. Also, I already have a lot of samples painted on this page, but I'm just gonna paint right into the spare areas to kind of show you the techniques, and then we'll do a full sample. For this particular painting, I've been using the number 4 Princeton round snap brush. Also very affordably priced. It's one of their, I think, kind of introductory lines, but it's a synthetic with a really nice, accurately named snap to the brush. And for this particular type of petal, I really like that texture in my brush. It also helps me get nice curving stems. Although I also will show you, I have this Escoda number 4. It's their Synthetico Prado line. It's a little on the softer side. It still has a pretty decent amount of spring to it, but it's just a little softer than the snap. And so sometimes I'll switch back and forth if I'm wanting a softer brush. But really, this isn't a particularly picky technique. You could use what you have. Okay, so there's the prep work. Let's dive right in. You're gonna wet your brush before you even go into that gray, and then you're gonna go right into the light part. I'll do a little swatch for you here first. Make sure that we like where it's at. I'd say that's pretty reasonable. It's very pale already, and it's gonna dry even lighter. So you'll find you're dipping your brush in the water a lot to keep the amount of dilution that you want. Let's see. So for painting these petals, the stroke that you need is pretty straightforward. You're just going to start with very little pressure to get that point, and you're going to quickly add a lot of pressure, and you're going to pick up slowly, because if you pick up too quickly, you're going to get a sharp point again. Like if I did this and then I pulled up quickly, it's going to point more. It's not that that's the end of the world. You'll just have to do another stroke to round it out. I'm going to move this down so you can see it a little better. So give yourself a little pointy tip and then a lot of pressure, and pick up kind of slowly so that you wind up with a round tip. I would just practice that a few times, and then once you feel like you can make that shape, practice making that shape turn a little bit, maybe off to the right, because that's the basic shape of the petal. They have 3 petals, and as you can probably see from the example, they kind of go around in a bell shape. So you're going to wind up needing to paint ones that face off to the left and off to the right, and ones that that seem a little more center, which making them a little chunkier will help foreshorten it and make it look like we're kind of seeing it sort of directly. Or if you wanted to paint one receding away from you, you'd want to paint it very short without much bottom tip at all. like that. And that one, maybe that would be the back petal if I had like 2 more flaring out these directions. So really the first trick to this is just practice some strokes. Practice them facing different directions. And then when you're comfortable with that, start making little trios. So I usually like to start with my main petal. Just sort of one of those basic strokes we did. And then I'll usually paint one, start at the same spot and paint one going off to one side. There you go, almost done. I'm gonna round that out a little, got pointy. And then maybe I'll paint one out to this side. There you go. I'm also reinforcing my color a little more than I might if I weren't painting for the camera, just because I want you to be able to see it. And if you're painting this for yourself, it's okay if you can barely see that paint when you first lay it down. You might be surprised how nice it looks when it's really all done. And mine might look a little bit on the gray side to you, but that's on purpose for this demonstration. So that would be a basic flower shape. These flowers start out tightly closed and they look like this one, like a bud. They just like they're all one thing. Pardon me again. But then they open, they sort of flare out into a wider bell shape as they mature. Paint a couple different little clusters. You can start making them, oops, that one's got like maybe a hair in it. Well, I don't know if I can get that out right now. Let's see. If you've got something stuck, one of the best things to do is dry your brush off a little bit and see if you can pick it back up. But I think it may have kind of already stained the paper a little. And since this is only a sample stroke, I'm gonna not fight it too hard. But as you can see, it got a lot better. You can only sort of see a little dot where that was. Okay, so get some new paint. If you make these petals much closer together, maybe even a very narrow one, because that'll make it look like it's kind of receding around the side, then it'll look like the flower is much more closed. It's only beginning to open for its life. So there you go. Paint a couple of those. If you want to paint your practice ones sort of arranged like this, then you'll be able to just add stems and boom, you'll have a painting. If you want to do the bud, you can kind of start with the same stroke, but you don't need to make it as pointy. It's just going to be kind of a simple, almost an almond shape, a little more pointed at both ends rather than having a super round end on one side. But it's pretty forgiving is what I'm saying. Once you get this little green cap on top, you'll be fine. Speaking of which, the little green caps. So wet your brush again and go into your green. If it got too dry, you may add a smidge more water. It doesn't need to be nearly as wet as the gray, but you do want some flow. And then for these, you can see they each have a little green cap on them, which is also sort of shaped like a bell. And the main trick to that is deciding which direction your flower is facing. Whether the curve on the bottom should go away from you or towards you. And the answer to that is whether the flower is facing away from you or towards you. You're going to do the opposite. So if the flower is facing towards me, that means it's blocking what would be the inside of the bell in the shape of this green cap. Like, let's imagine that there is no flower in this one. This little circle on the bottom would be the inside, and I'd be looking up into that cap. But once I put petals coming out of it, it blocks that. So I'm going to make the curve facing away from me. If the flower itself is facing away from me, then even without the petals, I would not be able to look up inside of that bell. I would only see the outside. So I'm going to make the curve go away from me. And that alone will give you a great sense of directionality for your flowers. You can see, you can see most of mine are facing a little bit away from me because with this type of petal, I find it a little simpler to paint. And I feel like for whatever reason, that's the way that snowdrops get portrayed a lot. So it makes them a little more iconic to paint them that way. Um, but you can do this any way that you want to. I'm sorry, I'm sneezing so much. It's a thing. So next up, let's see, those are still pretty wet, so I'm not gonna put caps on them yet. You totally can go straight for it. You'll get a lot of bleeding. Your flowers are gonna look really green. Like these ones here, that wasn't even bleeding from the stems. That was bleeding from adding the centers before they were really fully dry. So do be aware that if you paint too aggressively on top of this really pale color, it's gonna bleed a lot. And you might wind up with just entirely green looking flowers. So I recommend practice a couple of stem strokes before you start actually attaching things. Actually, first I recommend, if you're going to do a little finished practice painting, paint your flowers and then practice your strokes and then come back, because they'll be dry enough usually. Like, for example, let's say I'm going to paint, I'm not going to do a whole nother painting because I've already done these Snowdrop compositions several times. I've got not only those ones, but these ones as well. So I've painted a lot of sample compositions of them. So I'm just going to paint one or two flowers over here, and that'll allow you to kind of see what we're doing without using up a whole nother piece of paper for me. So I'm going to paint in my strokes to be my flowers. I'll do one that's a little more closed and maybe one that's a little more open. So that one's a little more closed. Maybe this one's going to be really open. It's mature. It's had most of its life already. I want to make sure you can kind of see what I'm doing over there. And then maybe I'll even add like one more bud up here, so you can kind of see that. Okay, so we're just going to let those dry while we practice some green strokes over here. And this is where if you find that you're struggling a little bit with getting nice smooth straight lines, you could try adjusting to a softer brush or a snappier brush, depending on what you're already using, because for some people that can make a big difference in how comfortable they are controlling their strokes. The other thing you're going to do is trying to see where I can do this so that my hand's not in the way, because when I do a straight line, my hand is often very straight up and down with my brush like a pencil, like this, and so I know that you can't really see me painting from that angle. So if I scooch way over here, I think you'll see it for a second. So pretty straight up and down, fairly even pressure. Remembering that these are plant stems, so it is okay if they get to be different widths. A little bit skinny here or there, or a little bit fat here or there, all very fine. And if they wiggle, also fine. Even plants that we perceive as having really straight stems, still there's going to be a lot of natural variation in them if you really pay attention. So that's why things like loose florals work really well, because it captures some of that organic prettiness that that nature creates, and our minds are really good at understanding that those imperfections are a natural part of that beauty. So the one thing you're going to need to do is you're going to need to practice getting a little hook on the end of your line. You might find it easier to start with that, to make the hook first, and then pull straight down. Might find that easier. You might find it easier to start at the bottom. Sorry, I'm painting right over the old stripes, I know. Start at the bottom and curve over. I find that fairly easy, but sometimes I like to start at the base of the flower because I've already placed my flowers first. So it depends on how comfortable you are with your ability to start a line somewhere else and come up and confidently connect to the actual goal. If you feel like you've got that skill mastered, then starting at the base of these stems might be a lot easier for you. one word of advice I will give when you're doing curves, if you're right-handed, it will most likely be easier for you to paint curves towards the right versus towards the left, because towards the right, you're going to be pulling the brush in a way that the brush hairs like. If you're going towards the left, you're going to have to really tilt your hand in an awkward angle to get those brush hairs to stay smooth instead of fighting against themselves. It's not impossible, it's just a lot less natural. If you're left-handed, it'll probably be the reverse. But that doesn't mean that you can only paint curves in that direction. Of course not. It just means that you might find it simpler if I was going to paint one like this. Maybe I would start with the curve, because then I can pull towards the right and come down. If I'm going to start with one like this, either I might start at the base and pull up, or I might do the curve itself. Wait, you can't see that. I might do the curve itself first, where I'm pulling towards the right, but stop here to connect to the flower, and then come back over and add the rest of the stem. So that's really all there is to it. They also have these little leaves that stick up on top. So once you've got your first stem put in, just kind of retrace it and let this flick off. Some of them wind up looking pretty skinny, some of them wind up looking pretty fat. Either way, totally fine. I recommend connecting them while your stems are still wet though, because the paint will connect more naturally. I'm painting these on a lot of dry samples, and yeah, it's not doing me any favors. You can also start where you want the leaf to land and connect with the stem. But again, if you're not all that confident about your line control, you might find it a little difficult to aim for a specific landing point, especially where the width of the line needs to be pretty similar, or you're going to get like a bunch of overlapping lines. It's a skill that you pick up over time with practice, so if you're still fairly new to this, that might feel frustrating to you, in which case I would just recommend start at the stem and go that way. Another trick, if you are having a hard time painting towards the left, or if you're left-handed towards the right, you can flip your paper upside down, and then all of a sudden the curves going the other way go the way you need them to. Some people might actually find making the U shape easier than doing the sort of overhand curve, if you will. Just food for thought. Practice a little bit until you know what you think feels really comfortable for you, and then do that. So next up, I'm going to show you the little caps for the flowers on these two samples that we did earlier, because they're nice and dry, and I already connected a stem to this one, so hey, why not? Frequently I put the cap on first, but it doesn't actually matter which way you go. Since this flower, I decided is facing away from me, and painting the curve to face, like the curve faces towards me because the flower faces away from me. Remember, they're opposites. And then I'm just sort of painting in that little bell shape. It's kind of like a triangle. I got a lot of liquid on there. I might pull a little bit off, but it doesn't really matter. And since I painted this stem recently, it's still kind of damp, so I can kind of merge those two colors together. Let's see, this one, I guess I'll paint it away from me so you can see. So if the flower is facing towards me, the curve of the bell will face away from me. And you'll see that'll make more sense in a minute when we add the inside of it. And then for this one, I definitely might choose to make my curve not all in one stroke, because I want to kind of carefully control how it's connecting, painting around these petals and whatever. So like there's a stem, right? And then inside, I know I'm looking up into this flower, so I'm going to paint right over the top of the white here for the inside there. And once that green is dry, I'll come back with a little bit more gray, and we'll add some detail. This one over here, maybe I can sort of see both. You know, the main inside piece is just basically a line with two dots at the end, or you can do two very, very close together lines that sort of flare out in different directions. A lot of them you won't see much inside, so it'll really almost just be like a tiny little stripe of green, and that'll be enough. Like if this one had faced away from me, you would barely have seen anything. I might have just put the tiniest hint of green in between them and called it a day. For the bud, the only thing I recommend is that the little cap kind of sits a little higher than maybe you might think. So they feel fairly separate from one another rather than being like down on top of it. And then it's okay to just paint your flowers right over each other because that's how they grow. So there's some kind of sloppy samples over here. These are feeling nice and dry. So let's put some green in them. I'm going to come up and over and down. That one I actually did do towards the left, but again, remember what I said, I've got a lot of practice at this. So if that's feeling awkward, there's lots of options for you for how to get that stem to look nice anyway. I already did the shadowing on this one. Otherwise, I would have just painted straight through it and I wouldn't have cared. Because I would know that I was going to use shadows to reinforce what we're looking at later. But since I already did that for this one, I'm going to just be a little more careful where I'm painting. But you can really just do a straight stripe and you can let them overlap each other willy-nilly and it'll all be totally great. There we go. Remember to get your little top leaf on there while it's still wet so that they blend together nicely. And then this one is going to face away from us. So the curve is going to face towards us. There you go. One stem down, 2 to go. This one, let's go ahead and have it facing towards us. So the curve will face away from us. And let's see, I think I might like that one to be sort of leaning. There we go. And a little flick on the top. And I'm just painting right up to the edge of that petal, kind of defining it with the green. There we go. And the last step. This one, I'm gonna have the flower facing away from us again. So the curve will face towards us. And this one will be, the petals will be in front of its own stem. It'll just come down here like this. I'm just fussing with the width of it. I really don't need to. I'm being picky. Also, sometimes if you want to add a little bit of extra darkness where there might be a shadow cast while those stems are still wet, it'll take that color and it'll let it kind of bleed in nicely. Also, sometimes I do just towards the base because oftentimes things near the base are a little more in shadow. Oops, sorry, hang on. Go. Okay, so you can see how, even though I didn't like put those shadows anywhere fancy. Just putting them where it might overlap places and letting the water do a lot of the hard work is already making them look very kind of joined in. The last few things that these need, maybe a little bit of gray detail, which I definitely recommend you let your green dry a bit before you do it. I'm going to show you on these guys over here what we're talking about. So get your brush nice and wet again, because your gray is going to dry out quickly. And then you're going to use it to create edges and shadows where you need them. So like I needed an edge there to show the direction of the petal, and I needed a shadow on these two to show that they're on the inside of the flower. I could definitely have painted that before the green and it might have been simpler, but I kind of forgot, so now I get to see it now. With these ones, also usually a little bit right near where it connects to the cone, and then maybe a little bit here at the bottom to show the roundness of the petal, maybe one stripe there, and one small stripe there. Maybe even a little bit there. What you're doing is you're just showing your lighting. So when you're gonna do your lighting, I would pick one direction your light's coming from. You can see over here that for the most part, my light is coming from the right, although this one got a little carried away with itself. But for the most part, it's coming from the light, from the right and from above. So you can see here on the right-hand side is light, on the left-hand side is dark. Left shadow, left shadow, left shadow, left shadow, left shadow. And then places where these little curvy leaves go over, they're gonna have sort of a cast shadow because it's also kind of coming from above. So places where things turn under, a little bit on the bottom there, a little bit on the bottom of these two turning leaves. That's on the left, but it's also kind of underneath. So pick a rule and stick with it, like on the left and on the bottom. You know, kind of like the way that maybe you used to do drop shadow lettering by hand in like your notebooks in school or whatever. Very similar sort of thing. You just know, like you always put that line on that side. So with the flowers, it's the same thing. Put a little where it connects to the cap, because the cap will sort of cast a tiny, tiny shadow on it. And then a little bit towards the left, towards the back, and leave something nice and bright. There you go, that's the shadowing for your flower. I'm gonna wait to do these because there's still a lot of wet green, and I want to show you the base greenery. Not every piece of green that sticks up is a stem. Snowdrops also have these kind of fat grass-like leaves that stick up as well. Not quite as round as like an aloe, but definitely chunkier the way that aloes are, rather than super thin like grass, but just with that sort of grass-like shape. So when I paint these, I start at the base usually with a sideways brush and a fair amount of pressure. And then as I come up, I let the pressure go and I turn the brush to a tip. And I let those cross over to look better. And then I come back and sort of adapt if I need to. But that'll give you the basic. That'll like lay down a color for you. Better to overlap than to constantly stop short of where your next thing is, or it'll just all start to look like it was kind of awkwardly crammed in there. Let's see, here's another one. Maybe this one I'll let go behind. There we go. And you can do the same thing we did with the others. You can just kind of drop some dark in your areas that might get a bit shadowy. While they are wet like this and overlapping, you don't want to do too much shadowing because it'll simply bleed wherever it wants to. So you won't have a lot of control yet. But when they dry, like these ones over here, you can just take your slightly more concentrated part of your green, less water, or you can even add a little dark, and you can just run down the left, and then sometimes a little on the base. And if that looks too stripy, if you want it to look a little bit more natural, get your brush clean and wet, and just run right alongside next to it, ignoring the fact that I accidentally picked up some red off of my drying towel. This is why sometimes you need to get a clean towel. Yeah, so now there's a little red on that one, but that's fine. It doesn't matter. So let's do it again. let's say this one is going to get a little bit of a shadow right here where it's curving over. And then we're going to skip over here down to the left. Okay. And then come over here, soften it. Be careful not to ruin all of your highlight since we have two sides that are getting softened. I wouldn't necessarily connect them, but you can if you want to. There we go. And that's how you have the shadows. Then when you're ready, I like to take the green. I like to make sure I'm using a lighter part. I might even re-yellow it just a little bit. And you just give that little boop peek of the inside. And here we'll see a little bit more of it because it's a little more open. That's all there is to it. You'll wind up putting a little bit of a shadow on these. I'm gonna try to do this without completely messing up the fact that they're not really as dry as they should be, but to the left, to the left. This one's not gonna get a little bit on the bottom actually, because it's really facing upwards a lot. Yeah, see, I grabbed my green. Oh well, you get the point. So there you have it. Those are snowdrops in about a half an hour, which is good. It usually takes me at least an hour to do a tutorial. I'm trying to work on getting it a little bit more condensed for you, because I think watching tutorials in real time is super valuable, but I also think we don't all have the time of day to watch 1,000,000 hour-long tutorials. So I hope this was helpful. Check me out on Instagram, Bristol_and_breve. And every Monday morning we do a live painting session, Q&A, have a little fun, drink a little coffee, very casual, come in your pajamas. Everyone's welcome. Thanks for watching.